सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
We've been so caught up in our domestic politics, crime, mafias lately. Before that, in the economy, what's happening to the dollar, all that stuff that we haven't talked about foreign affairs or a foreign country for quite some time. And in fact, if you see over the past several months, even if we have gone overseas by way of looking at an issue overseas, it's either China or maybe America, or usually something that emanates from the war in Ukraine, which I prefer to describe as Russia's invasion of Ukraine. More than a war, it's an invasion. Now, it's true that what's happening in Ukraine is a very important thing, and China, America, Russia, EU, right? Those are very important countries from India's point of view as well. But that doesn't mean that we don't turn our eye towards Africa, and also in this case, towards what I might describe with some justification as the most unfortunate country in the world. And that's the country of Sudan. And it's not a small country. Sudan right now, it's been divided between Sudan and South Sudan. So the South Sudan, which had a Christian majority, broke away after almost 2 decades of civil war that took maybe 500,000 lives. Anything in Sudan. Sudan's had a series of civil wars, and any civil war takes anything like 200,000 to 500,000 lives. And those are conservative counts. And each war then produces millions and billions of refugees and homeless people. That's the reason I say, this is probably the most unfortunate country in the world, because it's found so little peace. And even now, the reason we are going there is that yet another round of fighting is broken out. And this time, the fighting is in the city of Khartoum, which is the capital of Sudan. Unfortunately, one Indian living there, also Indian expat, also killed there. There are other Indian expats. And you've seen this argument that's going on between former Chief Minister of Karnataka, Siddaramaiah, and our Foreign Minister, S. Shankar, because Siddaramaiah is talking about the need to evacuate several Kannadiga, people from Karnataka who are employed there or working in Sudan. That apart, what is the fight about now? That is the fascinating thing. Because this right now, every fight, every war in Sudan has been fratricide, because it's been between people of the same country. So there was a fight between South Sudan and the rest of Sudan, South Sudan and let's say the main Sudan, for the simple reason that South Sudan is about 1.1 crore people today. South Sudan, by the way, is a sovereign country. It is the latest new sovereign country to find global worldwide recognition, right? And it was formed as a sovereign country in 2011 after seceding from Sudan. So that's about 1.1 crore people today, or 11 million people today. Sudan, on the other hand, is a little over 4.5 crores, maybe closer to 5 crores, because all of Sudan has very high birth rates. Very high birth rates means anything between total fertility rate of about 6. Say in India, it's 2.1 right now, which is replacement value. China is down to 1.2. America is 1.6. So those are for comparisons. The two Sudans are about 6. Life expectancy 59. In Sudan, incomes, per capita incomes, say about $750 to $800, maybe a little bit above or below, because it's very difficult to get an accurate estimation. But generally, in terms of per capita income, it ranks at 172 in the world. Once again, if you want comparisons, Sudan's per capita income today is about a half of Pakistan and about a third of India's. It's in that unfortunate country that a war has broken out. This is a civil war of sorts. Now, who are the people fighting? To understand who are the people fighting and why they are fighting, you have to go right back to both history and geography and also demography of Sudan. So if you look at the map of Sudan, it's a very large country. It's among the largest countries in Africa, the third largest country in Africa right now. In fact, if it had not split into Sudan and Southern Sudan, it would have been the largest country in Africa. Today, I think Algeria gets that distinction. It is the third largest country in Africa. It is also the third largest Arab country in the world. If you look at this country and look at the map, one, it's almost 2 million square kilometers of area. It's a lot of area, sparsely populated because a lot of it is desert or it's far away from the river. So as you see in these areas, civilization or habitations all exist along the river, which is the Nile River. So if you see the pictures of, say, Sudan or Egypt also from satellites, from space, you would see that almost 95% of the population, say, of Egypt lives within a few kilometers of the Nile River. And that is not different from the other countries where Nile River comes from. Now, Nile River passes in its full glory through Sudan. So both Niles, that is White Nile and Blue Nile, they meet in Sudan just short of Khartoum, just south of Khartoum. And then a little bit after that, the third tributary or third river that makes the Nile, or the third Nile, which is also called the Red Nile or the Black Nile or the Atbara River, that also meets the Nile River at the city of Atbara. So Sudan then gets the full flow of the Nile River. But if you see Sudan or around Sudan, see Sudan's neighborhood. First of all, if you see north of Sudan is Egypt. With Egypt, Sudan has had a mixed up relationship. There was a time when Egypt decolonized, and because of that positive impact, Sudan also got decolonized. But unlike Egypt, which got some kind of a stable government, Sudan did not get a stable government. So 1955, 1956, when Egypt was stabilizing, and that is when Nasser was rising, Sudan, in fact, saw the beginning of its first civil war. That started in 1955, went on till 1972. How many people it consumed, how many lives it consumed, search me. But from what I read, it could be anything from 500,000 people to 1 million people, or maybe even more than that. So that is the Egyptian influence. To the west of Egypt, say northwest of Sudan, that is Libya. But between the Libyan sort of mainland or inhabited areas and Sudan is the large, huge expanse of the Libyan desert, right? That's a wasteland. A little bit south of Libya or northwest of Sudan is Chad, right? That again is a country that's had trouble in the past. And then further south, as you come down, then you have the Central African Republic. So this is a tough neighborhood. To the south, as you would expect, is South Sudan. Again, if you go east, to the east, you will find Eritrea. Eritrea and Ethiopia have had their own troubled history. So Eritrea, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Central African Republic, Chad, Libya, Egypt, like that. Sudan lives in that neighborhood. Now, in that neighborhood, if you look sort of south of Libya, south of Chad, bordering Central African Republic, in that area, this is the extreme west of Sudan. Extreme west of Sudan is an area called Darfur. Does that ring a bell? It does, no? Because there was a big controversy about Darfur, about human rights violations, ethnic cleansing, big genocides. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed in ethnic wars. What was the war about? The war was about the minorities in Darfur. These were the non-Arab minorities of Darfur. These are African tribes. Not every tribe comes from an Arab origin. So these were non-Arab tribes or ethnicities in Darfur who believed that they were being victimized or discriminated against by the Sudanese government in Khartoum. They rose in revolt, and there was a big fight at that point. There was a big fight that led to all kinds of complications. And Darfur is not small. Darfur has a 6 million population. And you know what? In case you might be thinking that I'm digressing from what's happening today into talking about Darfur, in a couple of minutes you will know why it is not possible to understand what's happening today without figuring out what happened in Darfur. So the fighting in Darfur began in 2003, 6 million population, 80% rural. Local militias rebelled by 2003, and this was the non-Arab population. And they said that we were being discriminated against and we wanted to be free. So the government cracked down on them. As the government cracked down on them, the ruler of Sudan then, Omar Hassan al-Bashir, who had seized power through a coup in 1989. And Sudan has also had this interesting history of colonels seizing power through a coup. In 1969, Colonel Nimeri had similarly seized power, and he had survived in a very long time in power. In fact, he was in power where he did all kinds of things. He brought in some kind of parliament, threw it out, another kind of system, threw it out. Then at one point, he brought in the toughest of Sharia law, including public floggings. And this is not the odd flogging or rare flogging, lots of floggings, and also hangings, but not just hangings, also execution by crucifixion, right? That was Colonel Nimeri. He was got rid of, came another colonel, that was Colonel Bashir. And once you are the ruler of your country, it's easy for you to get promotion. So Colonel Bashir in the course of time became Field Marshal Bashir. So Field Marshal Bashir decided that he had to put down this trouble in Darfur. And who would he send there? He found his army chief, that is General Abdul Fattah al-Burhan. Now General Abdul Fattah al-Burhan, he comes from one of the elites of Sudan. Now the elite in Sudan, as in many of these countries, comes from some villages or some cities or some habitations along the Nile River, because that's where the prosperity is. Also, he was part of the Khartoum elite, a bit like what you might call the Latins Delhi elite or maybe the Khan market elite. There's also a Khartoum elite. So he was that elite. From there, he became an army officer. He went for training to Egypt and Jordan. So he was seen as a modern general. So he was sent to fight in Darfur and to put down this rebellion. As he was going to Darfur, he chose his own favorite to help him fight that battle, because he had to fight that battle not in the conventional or ethical military manner. This was going to be a bare knuckles, no laws followed genocide. So he chose as his favorite, he handpicked a man called Muhammad Hamdan, who was a camel trader turned militia commander. He was a brutal guy. So under him, he and Field Marshal or the head of state, Bashir, they set up a new militia that was called, popularly known as Janjaweed. Janjaweed, if you Google what does Janjaweed means, it really means, depends on what you're looking at. It can mean evil on horseback or a man carrying a gun on a horseback. But in terms of what Janjaweed did in Darfur, the former translation is more correct. This was evil in horseback, because this militia carried out the worst atrocities in Darfur. It became such a huge global concern, the genocides there, the killings, the ethnic cleansing, that this even bedeviled the 2008 Olympics in Beijing. So much so that Farrow, the actor, wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal to shame Steven Spielberg, who was involved with the Chinese government and the Olympic Committee in Beijing. And she wrote in that article that unless he uses his power to lean on the Chinese government, because Chinese government was very close to the Sudanese government, they had a lot of influence there, unless he could use his influence to get the Chinese government to stop the war or bring about a ceasefire, he should not be helping with the Beijing Olympics. Steven Spielberg wrote to Hu Jintao, the Chinese president then, and Chinese president sent his foreign minister to Sudan, and that brought about some kind of a ceasefire between the Darfur rebels and the Sudanese, right? It was around that time that the UN also in 2008 announced that they were going to set up a peacekeeping force, although the peacekeeping force was only deployed by 2009. That, however, was still a nominal ceasefire. And fighting keeps coming up all the time. In fact, even in the current round of fighting, some more fighting is broken out in Darfur as well. And that is where 3 employees of the World Food Program have unfortunately been killed. And that has led to World Food Program withdrawing its staff from Sudan. It's very strange that just the other day, the executive director of World Food Program, David Beasley, who is a former governor of South Carolina, he was in Sudan and he was hosted by both these generals, that is General Burhan and General Hamdan. Now go back to General Burhan and General Hamdan. General Burhan is sent by Bashir to put down the revolt in Darfur. He picks up Hamdan as his favorite executor or his favorite hatchet man. That's a job that Hamdan does very well. Hamdan, by the way, in Sudan is generally known by his popular name, which is Hamdati. Now, Hamdati commanded the militias, and in the course of time, militias became very large. Militias became very large and very powerful. Very large, very powerful, very brutal. The other thing that happened was that while these militias had grown in size and they'd been armed as well as the regular army, they were not under the regular army. And it suited Bashir to keep it like that. So while initially Hamdan was a choice of Burhan, now he had grown as a military leader or as a militia leader in his own right, not under the military's discipline. And Bashir, the president or the big leader, the strongman, began dealing with him as an equal. So much so, because he was so impressed with the kind of brutality that Hamdan had shown, that he described Hamdan as my protector. The result was that he set up a completely new security force under Hamdan, and that was called Rapid Support Forces, RSF. Now, RSF itself grew into about 2 lakh, right? 2 lakh. Sudan's regular armed forces were about 4 lakh. For a country of 4.5 crores, 4 lakh is a very large army. India, a country of 142 crores, has an army of about 11-12 lakhs with live active threats on multiple borders. But Sudan already had a large army, and then they built this large militia because they were fighting civil wars all the time. And for the regime to keep its power, because there's been a coup almost once a year in the past several years. I'm not even going into those details because that will take an hour. In fact, Bashir himself was removed by Burhan in a coup in 2019. Bashir, meanwhile, had empowered Hamdan as a leader, military leader in his own right. Hamdan now had become very powerful and very rich because he was not bound by military discipline. His soldiers were loyal to him. He could also give out his soldiers for hire. So he gave out a large number of his soldiers for hire to UAE to fight in Yemen. And that suited everybody, including the Western powers and America, because in Yemen, UAE, Saudi Arabia, they were supporting the Sunni forces against Houthis who were Shias. So Hamdan sent a lot of his soldiers and was paid quite handsomely, quite lavishly by the UAE for that, because, rich Arab countries, their armed forces may or may not be very good at fighting, but you will never know because their armed forces are never seen to be fighting, right? They can always hire other soldiers to fight for them. In fact, I'll take you back to the first Gulf War. That is when Saddam Hussein had occupied Kuwait, and I had gone to cover that Gulf War. And the joke then used to be among the press corps, because the press corps used to hang out together. The joke in the press corps used to be that the marching song of the Saudi army should be "Onward Christian Soldiers," because they were not the ones fighting. They had got the Americans and the rest fighting for them. So rich Arab countries, rich Gulf countries are all looking for armies for hire, which Hamdan was providing. Now what happened was, what caused this war now? What caused this war is quite simple, because Burhan is now in charge. Burhan is the general. He's in charge. Burhan is saying, I will not hand over power to a civilian government, right? In fact, the 5 civilian ministers in his cabinet, he's fired them also. So he said, I've set up a government of technocrats. I will not hand over power to civilians. I will now hold an election and hand over power to an elected government. You know what that means? Because we'll hand over power to an elected government, but he'll keep his own power above all of them. Elected government will report to them. He'll hire and fire them as he chooses, because that's been the tradition and history in Sudan all the time. But the breaking point, what caused this fighting to break out? The breaking point was that Burhan now said, look, 1 country, 2 armies, it doesn't quite work. So what I'm going to do is, I love these guys. I love these Janjaweed type guys. They are very good fighters, but they should be, if they're such good fighters, they should be in my army. So I will now recruit them in my army. So he said, I will now recruit 100,000 of these fighters in the militias led by Hamdan into my army. If that happens, right now he and Hamdan have kind of equal status. But if that happens, that's like taking Hamdan's army away from him. What does that reduce Hamdan to? So Hamdan won't accept it. And that's how Hamdan started deploying his militia troops in critical locations in Khartoum and elsewhere. Because this was now between two armies, and it is the two armies now that are fighting. Because one army that's commanded by the man who has supreme power in Sudan, he wants to absorb the other guy's army. The other guy, who may be the deputy supreme commander or deputy supreme strongman in Sudan, he doesn't want to accept this, because if his army is taken away from him, if his troops are taken away from him, then he's reduced to nothing. Because now, today, his troops not only are guns for hire, he can make money from that. Because he controls his militias, he also controls a lot of Sudan's gold mines. That's part of Sudan's resource curse, because they have oil, they have gold, they have other minerals. So he controls a lot of the gold mines. He's become supremely wealthy, and there is no way he's going to give in or give up. That is why this new fighting is going on. This is between the two generals. One was sent to put down the revolt in Darfur. The other was chosen by this first general to be his hatchet man in Darfur. Today, both have grown. They've got rid of the president who had sent them, and now they are fighting over power. That's the reason. To understand what's going on in Khartoum now, you have to go back 20 years to look at what started in Darfur.